The unlikely match. Sophia Winters clutched her coffee cup tightly, watching steam rise in delicate spirals. The cafe bustled with morning patrons, but she barely registered their presence. Her mind was elsewhere, on the contract sitting in her bag, on the impossible choice she'd made, on the stranger she would marry in 3 weeks' time. "You're sure about this?" Her best friend Vanessa asked, concern etching her features. "Marrying someone you've barely met? This isn't the 1800s, Soph." Sophia's smile didn't reach her eyes. "The Children's Speech Therapy Center needs funding. The Blackwood Foundation can save it." She traced the rim of her cup. "It's just business, Van. A merger of resources." What she didn't say was how desperately the center needed saving. Her patients, children who struggled to find their voices, needed a place that wouldn't close its doors. If marrying Julian Blackwood meant securing their future, she would do it. Even if the thought of marriage made her heart race with an entirely different kind of fear. Across town, Julian Blackwood stood at the window of his penthouse office, overlooking the city he'd helped redesign through his architectural firm. At 42, he'd built skyscrapers that defined the skyline, but couldn't repair the crumbling foundation of his family's legacy. "The board meeting is in an hour," his assistant Oliver reminded him. "They'll want updates on the foundation merger." Julian nodded, straightening his already immaculate tie. "And the background check on Ms. Winters?" "Impeccable credentials. Northwestern University, specialized in pediatric speech therapy, runs that little clinic downtown. No red flags." Oliver hesitated. "Though she's quite reserved, according to sources." "Not your usual type." Julian's mouth tightened. His usual type had left him with trust issues and a cynicism that pervaded his every interaction. "Perfect. I need someone who understands discretion and the nature of this arrangement." The Blackwood Foundation, his father's legacy, was teetering on collapse after a series of poor investments. The merger with Sophia's small but respected therapy center would allow him to restructure under a philanthropic banner, saving both their enterprises. A marriage would cement the partnership in the eyes of the conservative board. It was purely tactical. Nothing more. Their first meeting had been brief. A dinner with lawyers present, contracts discussed over appetizers, terms negotiated by dessert. She'd been quiet but sharp, her soft voice carrying an unexpected authority when she spoke about her work. Something in her dedication had resonated with him, though he'd buried the thought immediately. 3 days later, they met again at the Foundation Gala, their engagement announced to polite applause from people who barely knew them. He'd noticed how she flinched when the cameras flashed, how she kept her champagne glass full but barely sipped from it. Now, a week before the wedding, they sat in his lawyer's office, finalizing details. "The prenuptial agreement is standard," the lawyer explained, sliding papers across the polished table. "Equal division of any jointly acquired assets. Foundation control remains with Mr. Blackwood. Clinic ownership with Ms. Winters." Sophia nodded, pen poised above the signature line. "And the term? How long must we remain married for the merger to be considered legitimate?" 2 years minimum, Julian answered before his lawyer could. "After that, we can reassess." Her eyes met his, deep brown with flecks of amber, searching for something he couldn't name. "And the living arrangements? My penthouse has plenty of space. You'll have your own suite." He kept his voice neutral, businesslike. "Public appearances will be required occasionally, but otherwise, you're free to live your life." Something like relief flickered across her face before she signed her name in careful script. Later, as they walked to their separate cars, snowflakes began to fall, catching in her dark hair. Julian found himself speaking without planning to. "The foundation will transfer the first funding installment tomorrow. Your clinic can begin renovations immediately." Sophia paused, snowflakes melting on her eyelashes. "Thank you. Those children, they deserve a chance to find their voices." "Is that why you agreed to this?" he asked, curiosity overriding his usual reserve. "For them?" Her smile was small but genuine. "We all have our priorities, Mr. Blackwood. The children are mine." She hesitated. "What's yours?" Julian looked away, watching his breath cloud in the cold air. "Legacy, I suppose. Not leaving things worse than I found them." She nodded as if she understood completely. "Then we have that in common, at least." As she drove away, Julian wondered what else they might have in common, and why, for the first time in years, he found himself curious about someone else's thoughts. The wedding was small, elegant, and entirely for show. Sophia wore ivory instead of white, a sleek dress that whispered rather than proclaimed. Julian found himself watching her throughout the ceremony, noting the tremble in her hands as they exchanged simple bands, the way she closed her eyes briefly when he leaned in for the obligatory kiss, a barely there touch of lips that left him strangely unsettled. What had he gotten himself into? And why did this business arrangement suddenly feel much more complicated than he'd anticipated? Walls of glass, the Blackwood penthouse was a marvel of modern architecture, Julian's own design, Sophia realized as she followed him through the door. Floor-to-ceiling windows created the illusion that the living space extended into the night sky, the city lights below twinkling like earthbound stars. "It's beautiful," she murmured, setting down her small overnight bag. The wedding reception had been mercifully brief, a small dinner with close associates rather than the extravagant affair typical of someone of Julian's status. "Thank you. I designed it to feel transparent. No secrets, nothing hidden." Julian loosened his tie, watching her with those intense gray eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Your suite is this way." He led her down a hallway lined with understated artwork, original pieces, she suspected, from artists whose names she recognized from gallery openings she'd attended to secure donations for her clinic. Everything in this space spoke of careful curation, of a man who valued quality over ostentation. Her suite was larger than her entire apartment, a bedroom with another wall of windows, an ensuite bathroom with a soaking tub, and a small sitting area with bookshelves. "I had my assistant stock the shelves based on what we could glean about your preferences," Julian explained, hands in his pockets. "Feel free to change anything that doesn't suit you." Sophia ran her fingers along the spines, medical textbooks on speech pathology, literary classics, and to her surprise, a collection of poetry by Mary Oliver. Her favorite. "This is thoughtful," she said, turning to face him. The distance between them, perhaps 15 feet, felt both vast and insufficient. "Thank you," Julian nodded. "There's champagne in the refrigerator. I thought we might toast to our arrangement. A proper beginning." Sophia felt her heart rate quicken. This was the moment she'd been dreading since signing the contract. The expectation, the wedding night tradition, the thing she couldn't give, not yet, maybe not ever. "I'll change," she said quietly. "And meet you in the living room?" When Julian left, she opened her bag with trembling hands. She'd packed a simple silk nightgown and robe, modest but appropriate for a new bride. The bathroom mirror reflected a woman she barely recognized, dark hair falling from its elegant updo, makeup still perfect but unable to hide the fear in her eyes. 20 minutes later, she found Julian on the terrace, 2 champagne flutes waiting on a small table. He'd changed into casual pants and a simple button-down shirt, rolled at the sleeves. Less formal but still maintaining a careful distance, he handed her a glass. 2 successful partnerships. Sophia took a small sip, the bubbles doing nothing to dissolve the knot in her throat. Julian seemed to notice her discomfort, his brow furrowing slightly. "Is something wrong?" The moment stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. Sophia set down her flute, fingers twisting the unfamiliar wedding band. "I need to tell you something," she began, her voice barely audible above the ambient sounds of the city below. "Something I should have mentioned before the contract was signed, but I was afraid you'd withdraw the foundation support." Julian's expression remained neutral, but his posture tensed. "Go on. I can't." She took a shaky breath. "I'm not able to fulfill certain expectations you might have for this marriage. Not yet. Maybe not ever." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You mean children?" "The agreement doesn't require heirs, Sophia." "No, not children." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the mild evening. "I mean physical intimacy." The words hung between them like smoke. Julian set his own glass down, his movements deliberate. "I understand this is a business arrangement," he said carefully. "I wasn't expecting—" "It's not that." Sophia closed her eyes, forcing herself to continue. 5 years ago I was attacked. A patient's father who blamed me for not fixing his son quickly enough. The memory flashed, hands gripping too tight, words hissed with alcohol-soured breath, the terror of being trapped. "He didn't. It wasn't. But since then I can't bear to be touched that way. I've tried therapy, but—" She trailed off, unable to meet his gaze, certain she would see disappointment or worse, pity. The silence stretched until she forced herself to look up. Julian stood perfectly still, his expression not what she expected. Instead of frustration or dismissal, his eyes held a quiet understanding that stole her breath. "Thank you for telling me," he said simply. "Nothing will happen that you don't want, Sophia. Not tonight, not ever." She blinked, confusion replacing fear. "But the marriage, it needs to appear legitimate. I know there are expectations. The only expectations that matter are the ones we set." Julian moved toward the door, maintaining careful distance. "I'll sleep in my room. You have your space. The arrangement stands as agreed." Sophia felt lightheaded with relief and something dangerously close to gratitude. "You're not angry?" Julian paused at the doorway, backlit by the warm glow from inside. "I've built my career understanding that the strongest structures have proper foundations. They can't be rushed or forced." The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Good night, Sophia. Sleep well." Long after he'd gone, Sophia remained on the terrace, watching the city lights and wondering about the man she'd married. His reaction had been so unexpected. Not the reluctant tolerance she might have hoped for, but something rarer: respect. It was the first night in years she didn't feel defined by her trauma. Inside the penthouse, Julian poured himself a scotch, watching the amber liquid catch the light. He wasn't a man given to introspection, but Sophia's revelation had stirred something unexpected. His instinct had always been to control situations, negotiate terms, find leverage. Yet when faced with her vulnerability, those instincts had fallen silent. The business arrangement remained unchanged. The foundation would support her clinic. Her reputation would help rehabilitate his family name. But something else had shifted. Something neither of them had included in the careful clauses of their contract. For the first time in years, Julian found himself genuinely curious about another person, not for what they could provide or how they might be useful, but simply for who they were. Sophia Winters Blackwood was a puzzle he hadn't anticipated, with pieces he couldn't see clearly yet. His phone buzzed with a late message from Oliver. Foundation paperwork ready for morning review. Board members pleased with the marriage announcement. Share prices already responding favorably. Everything proceeding exactly as planned, except for the unexpected hollow feeling in his chest as he prepared for bed alone, wondering about the woman sleeping across the penthouse, a stranger who was now his wife, whose trust had just become strangely important to him. Building bridges morning light filtered through the automatic blinds, gradually illuminating Sophia's room as she stirred awake. For a moment, disorientation gripped her, the unfamiliar softness of the mattress, the panoramic view of the city, the weight of the platinum band on her finger. Then reality settled. She was married to Julian Blackwood. This was her life now. She found the kitchen empty but not untouched. A note sat beside a French press filled with still warm coffee, written in precise architectural handwriting. Early meeting with Tokyo clients. Help yourself to anything. Driver available if needed. Number on fridge. Something about the simple thoughtfulness of prepared coffee made her pause. Their conversation from the night before replayed in her mind. His unexpected understanding had left her off balance, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Sophia poured herself coffee and opened her laptop to review the clinic's renovation plans. The first foundation payment had arrived as promised, a sum that made her blink twice to confirm she wasn't misreading the zeros. With this funding, they could expand their therapy rooms, purchase cutting-edge speech technology, hire additional specialists. The possibilities were dizzying. Her phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa. Survived the wedding night? Details required. Sophia hesitated before typing. He was a perfect gentleman. Separate rooms. The response was immediate. Seriously? The notorious Julian Blackwood? The man who dated supermodels. Either he's secretly awful or surprisingly decent. I'm beginning to think the latter, Sophia replied, surprising herself with the admission. Later that afternoon, she visited the clinic to share the renovation plans with her small team. The enthusiasm in the room was palpable as her colleague, Dr. Thomas Rivera, pointed to the blueprint spread across the table. Speech simulation lab here. Sensory integration room there, he said, eyes bright with excitement. Sophia, this is incredible. How did you convince the Blackwood Foundation to invest so substantially? She touched her wedding ring reflexively. A mutually beneficial arrangement. Thomas raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Well, whatever you did, it's going to change lives. The Henderson twins can finally get that intensive therapy program, and little Parker won't have to travel across state lines for specialized treatment. Sophia felt a warmth spread through her chest. This was why she'd agreed to the marriage. Faces like Parker's lighting up when he successfully communicated a complete sentence after months of therapy. Parents crying with joy when their children spoke for the first time. "We'll need to close for renovations next week," she said. "I've arranged temporary space at the community center for urgent cases." As the meeting concluded, her phone buzzed with another text, this time from Julian. "Foundation board impressed with your clinic plans." "Dinner tonight? There's someone I'd like you to meet." PM Lumiere. Sophia felt a flutter of nervousness. Their first public appearance as a married couple. A test of their arrangement. Lumiere was the kind of restaurant where reservations were made months in advance unless you were Julian Blackwood. Sophia wore a simple navy dress, elegant but understated, and found Julian waiting in the lobby. Engaged in conversation with an elderly woman whose eyes crinkled with genuine warmth when she smiled. "Ah, here she is," Julian said, turning as Sophia approached. Something shifted in his expression, a momentary softening that vanished so quickly she wondered if she'd imagined it. "Sophia, this is Eleanor Rhodes, my former professor and mentor." "The woman who taught this stubborn man everything he knows about sustainable design," Eleanor corrected, taking Sophia's hands in her own. The touch was gentle, grandmotherly, causing none of Sophia's usual tension. "My dear, I've been so looking forward to meeting you. When Julian told me he'd married, I nearly fell out of my chair." Dinner was surprisingly pleasant, with Eleanor carrying most of the conversation. Stories about Julian as a driven young architecture student, his early designs, his refusal to compromise on material quality even when budgets were tight. He rebuilt an entire community center for free after the developers wanted to cut corners, Eleanor said, her pride evident. "Slept on site for weeks to supervise the work personally." Julian looked almost embarrassed. It was the right thing to do. The structure would have been unsafe otherwise. Sophia studied him across the table, seeing facets she hadn't anticipated. The public image of Julian Blackwood, brilliant but cold, successful but calculating, didn't align with Eleanor's stories or with the man who had handled her confession with such unexpected grace. After Eleanor left, they lingered over dessert, an unfamiliar comfort settling between them. "Thank you for coming tonight," Julian said, rotating his wine glass slowly. "Eleanor is important to me. One of the few people I truly respect. She adores you," Sophia observed. "You never mentioned your community work," Julian shrugged. "It's not something I advertise. The foundation handles most charitable initiatives now. But it matters to you," she pressed gently, "the integrity of your work." His eyes met hers, a hint of surprise in them. "Yes, it does." On the drive home, Julian received a call that he took with furrowed brows, speaking in rapid-fire Japanese. When he hung up, tension radiated from him. "Problem?" Sophia asked. "Structural issue with the Tokyo project. I need to fly out tomorrow." He glanced at her. "It might be good if you came. First public appearance internationally as a couple. The Japanese investors are traditional. They appreciate family involvement." Sophia hesitated. "The clinic. Thomas can oversee the initial renovation preparations," Julian said, then seemed to catch himself. "But of course, if you're not comfortable—" "No, I'll come," she decided, surprising herself again. "The clinic is closed for renovations anyway." The relief on his face was subtle but unmistakable. 2 days later, they were in Tokyo, staying in a sleek hotel suite with, Sophia noted, separate bedrooms. Julian spent days in intense meetings, returning late with the weight of responsibility evident in the set of his shoulders. On the third evening, she was reading in the living area when he returned, looking particularly exhausted. "There's tea," she offered, gesturing to the pot she'd prepared after noticing his preference for green tea over coffee in the evenings. Julian paused, seeming momentarily thrown by the gesture. "Thank you." He poured himself a cup and sat across from her. "You didn't have to wait up." "I wanted to," she said simply. "How was your day?" "Challenging. The foundation issues are worse than reported. We may need to redesign the lower levels entirely." He rubbed his temples and Sophia recognized the gesture, the same one she made when particularly frustrated with bureaucracy that delayed her patient's care. Without thinking, she stood and moved to a cabinet where she'd noticed a first aid kit earlier. Returning with 2 pain relievers, she set them beside his tea. "For your headache," she explained at his questioning look. "I recognize the signs." Julian's expression softened as he took the medication. Observant. "It's part of my job, noticing nonverbal cues." They fell into comfortable conversation about their respective days. Sophia found herself describing a local speech therapy center she'd visited, impressed by their sensory integration techniques. "I could incorporate some of their methods at the clinic," she said, animation in her voice. "Their results with selective mutism cases are remarkable." Julian watched her with unexpected interest. "You truly love your work." "It's not just work," she admitted. "It's purpose. Helping children find their voices when the world has convinced them they shouldn't be heard." Something flickered in Julian's eyes. Recognition, perhaps. "I understand that. Creating spaces that protect and elevate rather than constrain." The moment stretched between them, a bridge forming where there had been only careful distance before. When Julian's phone rang again, the interruption felt almost intrusive. That night, as Sophia prepared for bed, she found herself pausing at her door, looking toward Julian's closed room. For the first time since the attack, she wondered what it might be like to trust someone again. Not just with her body, but with the fragile, rebuilding parts of herself. In his own room, Julian stared at architectural plans without seeing them. His thoughts occupied instead by the woman across the hall, her quiet strength, her dedication to her patients, the way she'd anticipated his needs without expectation of return. The arrangement was proceeding perfectly according to contract. So why did it suddenly feel like something much more complicated was being built between them? Something neither had designed, yet both were beginning to value? The storm within rain lashed against the penthouse windows, the Tokyo typhoon having followed them home to New York, in the form of an unseasonable autumn storm. 3 months into their marriage, Sophia and Julian had developed an unexpected rhythm. Separate lives that intersected with increasing frequency and comfort. The clinic renovations were nearly complete, with the grand reopening scheduled for the following week. The Blackwood Foundation's reputation had stabilized, with Julian's marriage to the dedicated speech therapist softening his public image from cutthroat businessman to philanthropist. Everything was proceeding according to plan, which was why the envelope sitting on Sophia's desk at the clinic felt so threatening. "It came by courier this morning," Thomas said, hovering in the doorway of her newly renovated office. "The messenger said it was confidential." Sophia nodded, waiting until Thomas left before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a photocopy of a newspaper article dated 5 years earlier. "Prominent businessman's son attacks. Speech therapist Richard Harlow, son of industrialist Victor Harlow, arrested for assault." The article was circled in red ink, with a note scrawled in the margin. "Does Julian know he married damaged goods? Victor Harlow sends his regards." Sophia's hands trembled so violently the paper slipped to the floor. Richard Harlow had been her patient's father, the man who had attacked her, who had pleaded down to a misdemeanor through his father's connections, who had left her with nightmares that still woke her gasping for breath. Victor Harlow. The name surfaced in her memory. One of Julian's business rivals. Someone he'd outmaneuvered on a major development project last year. The implication was clear. Victor Harlow knew her history and planned to use it against Julian. Sophia drove home in a daze, rain pelting her windshield in sheets that matched her inner turmoil. The penthouse was dark when she arrived. Julian still at the office dealing with the fallout from the Tokyo project delays. She poured herself a glass of wine with shaking hands, the threatening note burning in her bag. Should she tell Julian? Would he see it as a liability? Proof that she'd withheld relevant information that could affect his business? Or worse, would he look at her differently once the full details were public? These past months had seen a gradual thawing between them. Weekly dinners had become nightly conversations. She'd found herself lingering in the common areas of the penthouse rather than retreating to her suite. Julian had started asking her opinion on foundation initiatives, valuing her insight on community needs. Last week, he'd fallen asleep on the sofa while they watched a documentary, his guard completely lowered. Sophia had placed a blanket over him, allowing herself a moment to study his face in repose. The worry lines smoothed out. The perpetual calculation absent. She'd felt something unfamiliar stir within her. Not fear, but its opposite. A wanting now this. The past she'd tried to bury reaching up to drag her back into darkness. The penthouse elevator hummed to life, announcing Julian's arrival. Sophia quickly wiped her eyes, but not quickly enough. Julian noticed her distress the moment he stepped into the living room. "What's happened?" he asked, dropping his briefcase and crossing to her with uncharacteristic urgency. Sophia hesitated only briefly before retrieving the note. Better to face this head-on than wait for the damage to spread. Julian read it, his expression transitioning from confusion to understanding to cold fury. "Victor Harlow," he said, the name sounding like a curse on his lips. "He's behind this?" "His son was the one who attacked me," Sophia explained, voice hollow. "The case was settled quietly. I wanted to avoid publicity that might frighten patients' families." She took a shaky breath. "I should have told you. If this becomes public—" "It won't," Julian interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Harlow is desperate. The West Side Project is slipping through his fingers, and he's grasping at anything to gain leverage. But if he releases this story, then we face it together." Julian set the paper down, his expression softening as he looked at her. "Sophia, you did nothing wrong. You were the victim of an assault by a man whose father protected him from consequences. If Harlow thinks this will damage you or us, he's severely miscalculated." The fierceness of his response stunned her. "You're not concerned about how this could affect the Foundation's image?" Julian's laugh held no humor. "The Foundation's image? Sophia, I'm concerned about you." He ran a hand through his hair, a rare display of agitation. "Has he contacted you directly? Threatened you in any other way?" "No, just this." She gestured to the note. "But Julian, there's more to the story than what's in that article." The words felt like stones in her throat. "Richard Harlow didn't just attack me, he tried to—" She couldn't finish. Understanding dawned in Julian's eyes, followed by a cold rage she'd never witnessed in him before. For a moment, he stood perfectly still, the architect assessing structural damage, calculating response. Then, to her surprise, he knelt before her chair, bringing himself below her eye level, a deliberate choice that gave her space. "Control. I need you to listen to me very carefully," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "What happened to you was not your fault. It does not make you damaged goods. It does not change who you are or what you've accomplished." He paused, seeming to choose his next words with extraordinary care. "And it does not change anything between us." Something broke inside Sophia, a dam holding back years of shame and fear. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and Julian reached slowly for her hand, telegraphing his movement to give her time to withdraw. When she didn't, he covered her fingers with his own. "Here's what we're going to do," he continued, his thumb brushing lightly across her knuckles. "First, I'm calling my security team to ensure you're protected. Then my lawyers will send a very clear message to Victor Harlow about the consequences of harassment and attempted blackmail." Sophia found her voice. "And if that doesn't work? Then we control the narrative ourselves." Julian's expression was resolute. "Your work at the clinic, the children you've helped, that's the story that matters. If Harlow wants to make your past public, we'll ensure the world sees the whole truth, including how his son escaped justice." The decisiveness of his response steadied her. This wasn't pity or obligation, it was protection freely given. "Thank you," she whispered. Julian's phone buzzed with a message, breaking the moment. He checked it with a frown. "Oliver says Harlow's representatives are requesting an urgent meeting tomorrow. Apparently they have matters of mutual interest to discuss." Sophia felt a chill. "He's going to use this to leverage the West Side Project, isn't he?" "He'll try." Julian's expression hardened. "I'll handle it." "No," Sophia said, surprising herself with her firmness. "We'll handle it. Together." The meeting took place in the Blackwood Foundation's conference room, neutral territory. Victor Harlow arrived flanked by lawyers, his patrician features arranged in a mask of professional courtesy that didn't reach his eyes. "Julian," he greeted with artificial warmth, "and Mrs. Blackwood. How lovely to finally meet you." Sophia met his gaze steadily, Julian's solid presence beside her giving her courage. "Mr. Harlow." The preliminaries were brief and tense, with Harlow's lead attorney dancing around the purpose of the meeting until Julian cut through the pretense. "Let's be direct," he said coolly. "You've made a thinly veiled threat against my wife." "I'd like to understand what you hope to accomplish." Harlow's smile tightened. "A misunderstanding, surely. I merely thought Mrs. Blackwood might want to revisit the unfortunate incident with my son. Perhaps a more generous settlement would be appropriate, given your enhanced circumstances." "Extortion, then," Julian replied, his tone conversational but his eyes hard, "along with harassment and attempted blackmail." "Interesting strategy." One of Harlow's lawyers leaned forward. "We prefer to think of it as an opportunity to avoid unnecessary publicity. The West Side project contract is still pending final approval. Certain revelations might complicate the process for all parties." Julian remained unmoved. "And in exchange for our silence, you want—" "A 50% stake in West Side," Harlow stated, dropping all pretense. "It's more than fair considering." The conference room fell silent. Sophia felt Julian's careful restraint beside her, the controlled anger in the set of his shoulders. Before Julian could respond, Sophia placed a folder on the table and slid it toward Harlow. "I believe you should review this before proceeding." Harlow opened the folder with obvious reluctance. Inside were testimonials, dozens of them, from children and families Sophia had helped over the years. Photos of smiling patients who had overcome speech challenges, news articles about the clinic's work, and at the back, sealed court records from 5 years ago that Julian's lawyers had expedited access to that morning. "Your son's sealed records detail the full extent of his assault," Sophia said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The physical evidence, the witness statements, evidence that never made it to trial because of your intervention." Harlow's face drained of color. "These are sealed. They won't remain that way if you proceed with this strategy," Julian interjected smoothly. "The Blackwood Foundation is preparing a major public awareness campaign on survivor advocacy. My wife's personal experience makes her an exceptionally compelling spokesperson." "You wouldn't dare," Harlow hissed. "Your family's reputation will only be enhanced by supporting survivors of assault," Julian finished. "The question is, how will yours fare when the full truth emerges about your son? About how you used your influence to protect him from consequences," Harlow's lawyer whispered urgently in his ear. But the older man waved him off, his focus locked on Sophia. "You think this makes you strong?" he sneered. "Hiding behind your husband's money and influence?" Sophia leaned forward slightly. "No, Mr. Harlow. What makes me strong is that despite what your son did, I continued helping children find their voices. I built something meaningful. I didn't let fear define me." She closed the folder deliberately. "Can you say the same about your son?" The meeting ended shortly after, with Harlow's team retreating under thinly veiled threats of counter-litigation. As they left, Julian placed a hand lightly on Sophia's shoulder, the first time he had touched her so casually, and yet it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "You were extraordinary," he said quietly. Something had shifted between them, the final wall crumbling. That evening, as rain continued to lash against the windows, they sat closer than usual on the sofa, the deliberate space they'd maintained for months now comfortably absent. "Are you really planning a survivor advocacy campaign?" Sophia asked. Julian's smile held a hint of mischief. "I am now." "It's an excellent idea, don't you think?" Sophia laughed, a genuine, unburdened sound that surprised them both. "I think," she said carefully, "that I'm very glad I married you, Julian Blackwood." His expression turned serious. "Even though it wasn't by choice?" Sophia considered this, realizing with sudden clarity that somewhere along the way, what had begun as arrangement had evolved into something she would now choose freely. "Some of the best things in life find us when we least expect them," she said softly, like voices returning to children who had given up hope of being heard. Outside, the storm raged on, but within the penthouse, something else entirely was building, a foundation stronger than either of them had dared to imagine. Where hearts find, Homespring arrived in a burst of renewal, 6 months into their marriage. The clinic bustled with activity, new patients, expanded programs, a waiting list that spoke to its growing reputation. The Blackwood Foundation had launched its survivor advocacy initiative to widespread acclaim, with Sophia serving as silent advisor rather than public face, her choice, which Julian had respected without question. The penthouse had transformed as well. No longer divided into his and hers, but gradually blending into shared space. Sophia's books mingled with Julian's on the living room shelves. A second desk had appeared in his home office. For when inspiration strikes during clinic paperwork, he'd explained casually, though they both recognized it for what it was, an invitation to proximity without pressure. On this particular evening, Julian returned home to find Sophia on the terrace, surrounded by potted herbs and flowering plants, a miniature garden she'd begun cultivating weeks ago. "Successful day?" he asked, loosening his tie and accepting the glass of wine she offered. "Very," Parker said, his first complete sentence without signs. Her smile was radiant. His mother cried. "So did Thomas. And you?" "Maintained complete professional composure," she said primly, then grinned. "Until I reach my office." Julian laughed, a sound that once would have been unfamiliar coming from him but had become increasingly common in recent months. "The board approved the expansion to 3 new locations," he shared, settling into the chair beside hers. "We can break ground on the 1st in June." The "we" wasn't lost on Sophia. More and more, their separate ventures had become collaborative, with Julian attending clinic events and Sophia offering input on foundation initiatives. "I've been thinking," she began, then hesitated. "A dangerous pastime," Julian teased gently, "about us." The words hung in the spring air, weighted with possibility. "This arrangement, it's not what either of us expected." Julian set his glass down, giving her his full attention. "No, it's not. Our 2-year minimum is approaching in a few months," she continued, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her glass. "We should probably discuss what happens next." The careful neutrality Julian had perfected over years in business settled over his features. "I'm listening." Sophia took a deep breath. "The clinic is thriving. The foundation has recovered. Technically, we've achieved what we set out to do." "Technically," Julian agreed, his voice carefully modulated. "But I don't want to end this." The neutrality fractured, surprise and something warmer breaking through. "You don't?" Sophia shook her head, courage gathering as she met his gaze. "I've been seeing Dr. Bennett, the therapist you recommended, for the past 4 months. Working through things." She twisted her wedding band, a habit she'd developed when nervous. "I'm not the same person I was when we signed those papers. When I told you I might never be ready for closeness." Julian leaned forward slightly. "Sophia, you don't have to." "I want to," she interrupted gently. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. I want more than an arrangement." "With you." The confession hung between them, fragile and monumental. Julian's expression shifted through a kaleidoscope of emotions. Surprise, hope, uncertainty, and something deeper that made Sophia's heart race. "I should tell you something," he said finally, his voice hushed in the evening air. "I've been drawing up plans." "For the expansion?" she asked, confused by the apparent non-sequitur. "For us." He reached for his portfolio, always within reach, and extracted a set of architectural sketches. "A house, outside the city. Something that's neither yours nor mine, but ours from the foundation up." Sophia stared at the drawings, a modern structure with warm elements, expansive windows reminiscent of the penthouse but nestled among trees. "A home designed for 2 people who valued both connection and personal space. You've been planning this?" "For months," Julian admitted. "I told myself it was just an exercise, something to work on when inspiration for other projects ran dry. But I think I was building our future on paper because I wasn't sure how to ask for it in reality." Sophia traced the lines of the master bedroom, a single shared space, not the separate suites they currently occupied. The implication wasn't lost on her. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice catching. Julian set the plans aside, his focus entirely on her now. "Sophia, these past months, you've changed how I see everything. My work, the foundation, myself." His hand moved tentatively toward hers, giving her time to withdraw, a consideration that had become instinctive for him. "I entered this marriage for practical reasons. I want to continue it for entirely impractical ones." When their fingers met, Sophia didn't flinch. Instead, she turned her palm upward, lacing their fingers together, a deliberate invitation. "We could start over," she suggested. "Not as a business arrangement, but as 2 people choosing each other." Julian's smile held a vulnerability she'd never seen before. "I'd like that." That night they sat together on the terrace until the city lights blurred with stars, talking about everything and nothing, dreams for the clinic's future. Julian's childhood fascination with bridges, Sophia's favorite patients, shared memories from the months they'd been gradually finding their way toward each other. As midnight approached, Sophia stood, still holding Julian's hand. "Would you walk me to my room?" Something shifted in Julian's expression. Understanding mingled with careful restraint. "Of course." At her door, she turned to face him. "Would you like to come in? Just to talk," she added quickly. "I'm not ready for everything, not yet. But I don't want to say goodnight either." "I'd like that very much," Julian said simply. Inside her suite, they sat on the small sofa in her sitting area, closer than they had ever been before. Sophia found herself studying his profile. The strong line of his jaw, the silver beginning to thread through his dark hair at the temples, the intelligence in his gray eyes. "May I try something?" she asked, her heart thundering against her ribs. Julian nodded, perfectly still, letting her set the pace, slowly, deliberately. Sophia reached up to touch his face, the first time she had initiated contact between them. Her fingers traced the contours of his cheekbone. "Featherlight experimental, okay?" she whispered. "More than okay," he assured her, his voice rough with emotion. Emboldened, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. A brief, gentle kiss that lasted only seconds but changed everything between them. When she pulled back, Julian's eyes remained closed for a moment longer, as if memorizing the sensation. "I've wanted to do that for months," she admitted. "I've wanted you to for longer," he countered, a smile playing at his lips. They talked until dawn painted the sky in watercolor hues, discovering each other in ways their carefully constructed arrangement had never allowed. Sophia shared stories of her childhood, a speech impediment that had inspired her career choice, overcome through the patience of a dedicated therapist. Julian spoke of his father's impossible standards, the drive to prove himself that had made him brilliant but isolated. When exhaustion finally claimed them, they fell asleep side by side on the sofa, hands still entwined, a new kind of intimacy neither had anticipated but both treasured. The following weeks brought gradual, meaningful changes. Julian's clothing migrated to a section of Sophia's closet. Her favorite books appeared on his nightstand. They learned the rhythm of sharing space, Julian rising early, Sophia staying up late, meeting in the middle for dinners where conversation flowed, without the careful distance that had once defined their interactions. Physical intimacy evolved at Sophia's pace, each small step forward a victory over the shadows of her past. Julian's patience never wavered, his understanding creating the safety she needed to heal. 3 months later, they stood on an empty plot of land an hour from the city, architectural plans in hand, as a contractor marked foundation points for what would become their home. "Are you sure about this?" Julian asked, watching her face carefully. "The penthouse is perfectly—" "The penthouse was yours," Sophia interrupted gently. "This will be ours." As if to emphasize the point, she reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "I had my lawyer draw these up." Julian opened it, finding their original marriage contract with amendments marked in Sophia's neat handwriting. The 2-year minimum term had been crossed out, replaced with a single word: permanent. "You're sure?" he asked, hope evident in his voice. In answer, Sophia stepped closer, wrapping her arms around his waist, a gesture that once would have been impossible for her. "I've never been more certain of anything." Julian enfolded her in a careful embrace, pressing his lips to her forehead. "I never expected this when I proposed our arrangement," he murmured against her skin. "To find someone who understands me, who makes me want to be understood." Sophia smiled against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "The clinic needed saving. Your foundation needed rehabilitation. Neither of us was looking for anything more. And yet here we are." "Here we are," she agreed, looking out over the land that would hold their future, building something neither of us designed but both of us need. 6 months later, they stood in their completed home, open spaces filled with light, separate studies connected by sliding doors that could remain open or closed as needed, a bedroom where nightmares came less frequently and were soothed by gentle hands when they did on the anniversary of their wedding, a day that had once marked a business transaction. They hosted a small gathering. Eleanor was there, delighted by the evolution of their relationship. Thomas brought his family, his children racing through the garden Sophia had designed. Oliver arrived with the news that the Foundation's advocacy campaign had secured funding for a national helpline for assault survivors. As twilight fell, lanterns illuminated the patio where Julian raised a glass. "To unexpected beginnings," he said, his eyes finding Sophia's across the gathering, "and to the courage it takes to trust." Later, after the guests had departed, they stood on the balcony of the master bedroom, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Do you ever regret it?" Julian asked quietly. "Our unconventional start?" Sophia considered this, her head resting against his shoulder. "I think we needed it. You needed someone who valued your integrity over your success. I needed someone who would give me space to heal at my own pace." She turned in his arms to face him. "Some love stories begin with thunderbolts. Ours began with a contract. And transformed into something neither of us could have drafted," Julian finished, drawing her closer. In the distance, the lights of the city glimmered, the place where they had begun as strangers with separate goals, now viewed from the home they had built together, brick by careful brick, patience by hard-earned trust. "I love you," Sophia whispered. Words that had once seemed impossible now flowing easily, naturally. Julian's arms tightened around her. His response felt as much as heard. "And I love you." No terms, no conditions, no expiration date. In the quiet of their shared space, surrounded by the life they had carefully constructed together, they stood perfectly still. Two people who had found each other in the most unexpected of arrangements and built something neither had dared to imagine. A love defined not by passion's first blaze, but by the steadier, more enduring flame of choice, respect, and time. Moral: true love isn't found in perfect circumstances, but built through patience, respect, and the courage to heal together. Sometimes the strongest foundations are formed when we let someone else see our broken places and find that they don't turn away, but instead help us rebuild.